So what I'd like to do is talk to you today about populism. And the reason I wanted to talk about populism is because everybody's talking about populism. I think there's people who have a lot of opinions about populism, but I don't think that we have any really good way of putting it into context or to understand really what's driving what has become the dominant political force in the world today. And it's interesting to me that, we regard it as a political thing, but it's actually becoming a big thing in terms of all of how society reacts to various things that are taking place, including people who are working in the private sector. So what I thought I would do today was walk you through some of the things that I know, based on the research that we do at Ipsos, about what is behind populism, and maybe give you some thoughts about how you might want to be considering it relative to the global economy and what we're going to be doing as we get global, and to understand maybe where this is going to go and how we should maybe, as I said before, be preparing for it. Now, the first thing is that what it is not exactly clear. I think the word populism is a bit of a misnomer. First thing is populism is not necessarily that popular. It's not like 100% of people agree with a lot of the policies that people who are, for example, populist candidates are necessarily putting out. But what it is powerful. And it's something that brings people together, whether we're talking about what just happened in the, I guess, the midterm elections here in the United States, but the United States is only one place where we're seeing this. It's actually started much earlier in a number of other places. But, this description is the way that we've decided to label what is really somewhat of a revolt of the public against what they see as elite opinion. And really there's three things that lead to the creation of populism. One of them is a public opinion environment. People have to be upset. It doesn't take place under normal conditions. People have to be upset about the way things are going. There has to be an opportunity structure. So in other words, there has to be a political situation that makes it possible. There's no populist revolt in the United States of any import unless you have an electoral college at the presidential level. There's no populist revolt in a place like Germany unless you have proportional representation in terms of the electoral system. So the system actually has to be set up particularly for strong minorities that can be politically decisive. And thirdly, you need a political entrepreneur who's willing to throw the match. If anything, populism is more a political strategy than it is anything else. And we have, unfortunately, in this world today, no shortage of political entrepreneurs who are willing to use that strategy in these circumstances in order to make the populist bomb go off. Everywhere from Viktor Orban in Hungary through to Bolsonaro a couple weeks ago in Brazil, through to Obrador in Mexico. And by the way, populist doesn't necessarily mean from the right, it can also come from the left. It's a political strategy more than it is an actual reflection of an ideology. We can go to one of the ultimate populists, Putin in Russia, obviously Donald Trump in the United States, but also people like Marine Le Pen in countries like France. So this is a global phenomenon. It's not just something specific to what's happening in the United States right now. And a lot of what's driving it is this concept of the strong man. Now notice I didn't say a strong woman, because most of the leaders of these populist movements tend to be men. But it's all based on a philosophy that seems to have erupted around this particular form of political leadership and this particular political strategy. And it's based on this idea that something's gone wrong. Something's gone wrong in the world and we have to set it right. A belief, for example, that our country is rich, that I'm actually feeling like the economy is doing relatively well. But why are so many people so poor, and why am I not feeling any richer? The establishment or the elite no longer cares about people like me. Why? Because the system is rigged to their advantage. And the only way to hit back is to find a political leader to take our country back. And by the way, this, as I said before, is not unique to Donald Trump. He's not the first to do it, and he won't be the last, because this political strategy is really paying off in a lot of places these days. So it's this, in Spanish you call it the Cadillo syndrome, that idea that you have a strong person who's going to come in and upset the apple cart. The conditions are ripe for that all over the world these days. And you need a combustible public opinion environment in which all of this takes place. It's like the kindling that sets off the fire. The political leader throws the match, but the public opinion environment has to be combustible for it to go off. So this idea that the society is broken, is somehow in decline, that our best days are behind us, which, by the way, people in the United States do feel right now. This generation will be worse off, or is worse off than the last, and the next generation will be even worse off. The economy is rigged for the advantage of the rich and the powerful. I feel like a stranger in my country. This is a really powerful impetus behind a lot of the anti-immigration pushback that you're getting in places like the United States, but not just the United States, places like the UK. This was a big factor in what happened in the Brexit election, even in France in the last presidential election, Viktor Orban in Hungary. A lot of these other places, it's being driven by people's reaction to immigration. And people in that country feeling like they're no longer in control of the evolution of their culture. They no longer understand what it is, for example, to be French anymore, because it's changing too much as a result of immigration. Traditional parties and leaders don't care about people like me, and I want a strong leader to take it back. So in the United States today, 58% of the people in the world today think that their society is broken. Almost 60% of people in the world think that. In the United States, the number is almost 10 points higher, 66%. The economy is rigged for the advantage of the rich and powerful. 70% of people around the world think that today. 70% of Americans think that. And I need a strong leader to take the country back from the rich and powerful. 63% of the world thinks that. 69% of Americans think that. This is the type of combustible environment that I'm describing. Now, there are really two theories as to why populism is kicked off. And one of them is, I don't know if you're familiar with the book by J.D. Vance called Hillbilly Elegy, but it's the one that the elites prefer. That's the analysis of what's wrong in American society that the elites really prefer. And by the way, elites all over the world prefer this analogy, or this discussion. And the reason is because it's a comfortable discussion. It's about class. It's about the disadvantaged having their lives disrupted by economic globalization, the hollowing out of manufacturing in many companies as those jobs go off to Asia, and particularly lower middle class white men being left behind by globalization. They love that conversation. And the reason they love that conversation is because it's one that polite elites on both the left and right can have, because the policy instruments are well understood. We should have more free trade, we should have less free trade. We should have higher taxes, we should have lower taxes. We should have more accessible health care or less accessible health care. We should have better welfare programs or worse welfare programs. Government spending should go up, government spending should go down. We can have polite conversations about that all day long. And that's where we like to put this conversation. But it's the wrong conversation, because economics, when you look at it in terms of analyzing what drives public opinion around populism, is a subtext. It's there, but it's not really what's driving it. What's really driving it is nativism. And nativism is a much harder conversation to have. Now, what is nativism? Nativism is the policy or a predisposition towards protecting the interest of the native-born over the foreign-born. It's that idea of taking America back, taking France back, taking Britain back. This idea that what we have to do is protect our culture somehow from the type of change that's being brought about mostly by immigration. This is a very uncomfortable conversation for the elite to have. It speaks to issues that we're not comfortable dealing with. So really, the response from the elites tends to be, the political, both the left and the right, tends to be either a lecture and figure wag about tolerance, or some big statistical argument they can make about immigration being so much better for our country because of our declining birth rates and how our demography in terms of generations is in transition. By the way, one of my favorite arguments, because I like to make it all the time. But really, it's not dealing with the central problem that's causing this to take place. There are grievances that people who are predisposed to voting for populist options feel are legitimate. And when the elites withdraw from them by pretending it's about economics, or by pretending that the way that they can take care of these opinions is to simply dismiss them or lecture them, that's when the opportunity opens up for the political entrepreneur who wants to be a populist to throw the match, because they know how to set that off. They're prepared to talk to those people about what the issue is. They're prepared to tell them that they're right. And they're prepared to show that being ignored by the elites who prefer not to deal with these situations is a further demonstration of the fact that those elites aren't prepared to deal with the problem. And if we don't have our best minds and smartest minds dealing with the problem, we open it up for the populists. And that's what's been happening over the space of the last decade around the world. So we'll be returning to the way things used to be at some point. We'll be going back to the way things were, that polite governing coalition in the middle of both the left and the right who can basically agree on what the things are that we're allowed to talk about in politics, and the answer to that is no. We're just at the beginning of a huge political readjustment and a new political super cycle. This is going to be happening around the world on a regular basis now, and we need to get ready for it. So we need to understand why it's happening. Part of this is driven by what I like to call ideological tribalism. So we are becoming much more tribal in society. People are either defining themselves as the left or the right, but not in the way that we normally understood it. Left and right usually was a class-based thing, one who was for the business class versus somebody who was for the working class. That's not what it's about anymore. The new left and right tends to be more around this nativist continuum, somebody who's pro-nativist and somebody who's pro more open societies. That's the debate that we're having now. It's a new ideological continuum that's emerging in the world, and it's pretty tribal. The ironic thing is that this is happening at the same time as our opinions on a lot of, what used to be really difficult social questions have all been liberalizing. So for example, gay marriage. A majority of Americans now support gay marriage. Anything that has to do with basically human rights issues or freedom of choice types of issues, Americans have been moving more progressive on those issues for a long time, as have most people. But at the same time, we're moving into these two tribes around the issues that I just described. And I'll give you just a quick review of how tribal American is becoming. And the thing that'll be interesting about this list that I'm going to give you is not that it's political, but that it's not. Because what's happening is this tribalism is now moving into the private sector. And people are looking at brands, and they're looking at businesses through these lenses too. So for example, if you're a Democrat, you're about 3 times more likely to have donated money to NPR. If you're a Democrat, you shop at Whole Foods regularly. You prefer to buy organic foods when they're possible? They'll watch soccer on TV more than Republicans will. Now that's interesting. Soccer, the world's most global game. If you're a Democrat, you'll watch it, but if you're a Republican, much less likely to watch it. You'll drink sparkling water. If you're a Republican, you're more likely to shop at Walmart regularly. You'll drink bottled water, but not sparkling water. You probably at some time in your life have lived in a rural area, more likely than a Democrat. You love baseball, not soccer. You learned to drive before the age of 15. Why? Because you lived in a rural area where people in rural areas do that sort of thing. You enjoy NASCAR, 2 times more likely than a Democrat does. And you drive a pickup truck, 2 times more likely than a Democrat would. And those are the kinds of tribes that we're creating. So if you drive Prius, you're saying something about yourself to the world. But now you're saying it not just through your own personal choices about the environment, but also which political tribe that you belong to. Same thing if you drive a Ford 150. Now, I don't know if the people who actually sell those products in the world get that that's what they are now, is not just products for, you know, if it's a Ford F-150 for, you know, hauling stuff around at the farm, but it's also an opportunity for you to signal who you are to other members of your tribe. I'm a member of that tribe, but also to the other tribe that you're not a member of. So it's very difficult to understand how we return to normal when this is going on. Combine that with a world in which we ask people today, are you overwhelmed by the amount of information that you have access to? And the answer is 80% say yes. So this idea that you can go and have reasonable arguments with people, you can just provide them with a great fact sheet and they're going to listen to everything that you have to say, they're overwhelmed. And the other part of it is they don't know who to trust. So the future battle is really over how you become trustworthy within the context of those tribes. And I know one of the hottest things in marketing, I mean, the last two Nobel Prizes for economics have been awarded for behavioral science, but it's a really good lens through which to look at how people now make decisions. Now, we talk about hot and cold thinking, we talk about system one, we talk about system two, this idea that you have a more emotional decision-making structure in your brain that actually physiologically deals with fast decisions, and then you have a slower one that's more deliberative. I actually think that's kind of nonsense. I agree with Jonathan Haidt on this. I think that system two is really our justification for system one. That most of the decisions that we make are based on this type of hot cognition, which is system one, and what we do is justify those decisions by trying to make them more deliberative and claiming that they're system two, but they're really more of an emotional response. And this type of a situation in an overwhelming environment in which people really don't know who to trust is ideally set up for hot cognition, and we're seeing a lot of it. There's a lot of priming. Most of the reaction that people have to things they make very quickly, and it's done emotionally. There's a short circuiting of deeper cognition based on appeals to that more emotional level of decision making. There's a differential credibility of messengers. So not only are we evaluating the quality of the information that we're getting from people, we're basing it on the quality of what we see in their character, which tribe they represent. And we're always looking for the cues and clues related to tribal recognition. You're telling me this because your political agenda is what? And how do I relate to it? But the other thing is that this is, as I said before, going global. So we tend to look at the United States and we say, oh my God, this is the place where all this is happening. No, it's happening all over the world. And one of my favorite quotes is there's two famous beginnings to books. One of them is, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I actually happen to like Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, which is all happy families are alike, and each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And that's important when it comes to populism, because populism is not the same everywhere. Obrador is a left-wing populist. Sure, based on the Cadillo idea that he wants to take the country back from the elites, but he's arguing on behalf of the working class, mostly on an economic basis. Donald Trump is not doing that. His argument, even though he couches it in economic terms, is really more related to the character of America. Who's a real American and who isn't a real American? This is part of what you're seeing in places like Eastern Europe, where it's I'm a real Hungarian or I'm not a real Hungarian. I'm a real Pole or I'm not a real Pole. I'm a real Czech or I'm not a real Czech. It depends on where you go. There's different drivers for it, but the overall political strategy that relates to it is always the same. So where are places that people combine both ideas? You know, the system is broken, but also, I believe, you know, kind of this nativist position. The places I'd be watching are places like France and Italy, and we've seen that happen overwhelmingly in both of those places. Spain, we're now starting to see it emerge. Belgium, and even Turkey, which, by the way, has one of the largest migrant populations in the world. I mean, we think that what's going on in terms of immigration is really big in the United States. It is in terms of total numbers. About 1 million people come here a year. But if you look at the absolute numbers of where migrants are going, they tend to be in places that are very closely related to the trouble zones that they're in. So huge migrant settlement areas are places like Kenya. We don't even talk about it. Or places like Turkey, which have several, actually, I think in the last 5 years, almost 1 million Syrian refugees have moved to Turkey. So they're really concerned about the impact of migration and immigration, and they're reacting to it. So part of what you're seeing with the transformation that's happening in Turkey, and not, I would say, a particularly positive transformation, is related to that question. Populism again. So finally, where to from here? I think that we have to acknowledge the fact that there has been an evaporation of the governing consensus in a number of countries, and it's becoming a worldwide phenomenon. We're moving into this more tribal world, and those old polite elites that used to govern their countries from the center are having a harder and harder time doing that. Next, the volatility and division based on the tribalism that I described is increasing. It's not going to go back to the way that it was anytime soon. As I said, I think we're at the beginning of a political supercycle. We're not at the end of anything. Unfortunately, there is no shortage of political entrepreneurs who are prepared to use this strategy in order to win. And we're seeing it all over the world. Culture is the critical element here. It's not just a matter of dealing with economic issues. It's cultural. And that's the dominant factor. In this world of hot cognition, it's harder and harder to break through to people in any sort of reasonable way. You have to find an emotional way to connect. And if you're anybody who's related to any brands or any marketing or any activity that you're, service or good that you're trying to sell to the public, understand that they're looking as much at who you are and what you represent as what you sell. It's not the same everywhere. It's nuanced by country. Different factors are at play, but the basic structure that I'm talking about is very similar. Populism is now creeping into commerce. The question is, where do you fit? The opponents, I would say, people who want to get back against this populist political strategy, need to move past, which I don't want to be rude, but I will describe as virtue signaling and shaming. Telling people they're bad people doesn't make them good people. It's actually more fuel for the nativist fire. You're just proving the point. We need to understand, engage with, and diffuse this feeling of grievance that exists. Lecturing and telling people that they're wrong is not going to do it. We need to find a way to engage. And at the end of the day, none of this is about winning debates. So being right is not enough. You have to win elections. So the opportunity structure is there for populists to take advantage of everything that I've just described. The question is, for those people who want to push back against it, are you prepared to get into the trenches and engage in the process of defeating this very destructive force in the world by understanding that you have to get in that game and play it too? Thank you. So I've got one for questions if anybody wants to throw anything at me. Sir?
Yeah, historically, what have been some factors that have ended populism, aside from your final point stating the surface?
I think, unfortunately, the history on this isn't particularly good, because normally what's happened is we've settled it through a war. And I don't think anybody wants to see that as being the conclusion here. But ultimately, I think what it will probably take is, as I said before, countries really trying to understand what it is that people need in order to deal with cultural change. I'll give you a country that, and it's my home country, we actually are doing a reasonably good job of dealing with it, but we're not panda bears. Canada, I mean, gets this reputation in the world like we're all cuddly and people that this would never exist there. It's just under the surface. It wouldn't take much. But the two things that we've got going for us in Canada is, first of all, our approach to immigration is very different than a lot of other countries' approach to immigration. So we cream skim immigrants. You have to qualify to come to Canada. We don't have a huge level of irregular immigration coming into the country or undocumented immigration in the country. We have the highest percentage per capita of immigrants that come into our country every year. It's about 1% of our entire population. It's a huge number of people. The equivalent number in the United States would be 3.6 million, and you're not getting that number every year. We're getting about 360,000 every year in Canada. But we have that, so we have a very strict approach to how we govern immigration. And the second thing is that we have a real focus on multiculturalism and tolerance in terms of the way the government approaches everything that we do. And without those two things, it's very, very hard to fight this cultural battle and win. So immigration reform is an absolute necessity in the United States, and somehow, some way, people are going to have to find a way to engage on a cultural argument in a productive way with Americans, I think, because it's not happening right now. So that's one success story, I would say. And there's another question, sir?
On the same line of who are you seeing that's making a case for globalism that it's worth following?
Well, you know, I put in the last line of this presentation because I saw a very interesting debate last week, David Frum against Steve Bannon. Yeah, and I watched it, and I would say the problem I have with David Frum's argument is he won the debate. He actually did. I mean, there's a problem with the scoring system. But Steve Bannon would have won an election. And that's the problem. The side that's making reasonable arguments about globalism is talking to itself. It's that group that I talked about at the start. Those polite people in the middle who can talk about taxes, or they can talk about better trade policy, or they can talk about, deindustrialization and how you deal with it, and everybody else is talking about something else. And the problem is the people who are smart on these things aren't engaging on that something else because they're not comfortable with it. They think it's not a legitimate question, and they're missing the boat. Sir? We can stop there. That's good. You totally agree with me. That's fine.
Do you see consistency and diversity in the forces in a given society that in many ways stand behind those quote-unquote political entrepreneurs or are more successful at navigating the outcomes that those political entrepreneurs are able to produce?
Yeah, so that's why I gave you the Anna Karenina quote. It's different in every country, but the basic structure of it is pretty much the same. But the one thing it always needs is a political entrepreneur who's prepared to go there. It's the world is feeling extremely disrupted. The world is uncomfortable. There's a lot of change going on that people are struggling with. Everything that you can imagine is different in people's lives than it was 10 years ago. And they're overwhelmed. So when somebody walks in and offers a simple solution to that problem, it's appealing. And particularly when you don't know who's a good guy and who's a bad guy in this scenario, and you've moved into that tribal kind of a way of evaluating everything that comes in your direction, that political entrepreneur becomes extremely powerful. And sometimes it's behind issues like, for example, as I said before, cultural change, which I think are the dominant ones. Sometimes it's behind issues about, like we just watched in Brazil, a corrupt government. Different things in different places, but the structure is the same. Any more questions? I have one up here.
Do you think that perhaps the best advice for businesses would be to stay home, hunker down, wait for it to pass? Why would people even venture out?
Because it's coming your way. There is no safe place. So even in your own domestic market, you're going to be dealing with it. What I would say is it offers tremendous opportunities for people who can figure out how to connect with what's going on in those cultures and offer solutions. So actually, one of the best solutions, I think, to populism is not necessarily going to come out of government and politics, it's going to come out of business. And the reason is because you've got the flexibility in business to respond to some of these things. And you can move faster and you can move consistently on a global basis. We've never been able to get our political space and our governing instruments aligned with what we can do in the private sector. So what I'm hoping is that businesses and entrepreneurs can somehow find a way with all of the skills that you have, along with all of the resources that you have, to make connections to those people who are feeling disaffected by change, to make them feel better about what's going on and offer them some form of hope. And that's why I think that The idea that a corporation is more than just the products and services that it sells, it's a personality, it's an actor in the world, offers tremendous opportunity for those who are prepared to step up to it. But by the way, I would absolutely say that the point of your question, which is it's really scary, and I don't know when I want to get up in the morning. I think that's a really valid point, and there is some justification for saying that you want to stay home. But like I said, this is one of those things that's going to find you whether you like it or not.
Up until your talk, which that is, by the way.
Well, thank you.
I would have said that populism was the outgrowth of the 2018 global recession, which affected all of these people, and in fact was perceived as being caused by elites, by banks, by unethical Wall Street, and so on. So my question to you now is, if it's a cultural, would we still be here if we hadn't had the recession?
No, I think the recession was more kindling on the ground. There's more kindling on the ground. All of this stuff ladders up. But the thing that really gets people going is the cultural change issue. So, why is Donald Trump talking about a caravan in the midst of the election, even though he's got this, arguably, you debate it, I'm not American, so it's among you. It's your own family feud. Why is he talking about that at a time when he's got such great economic numbers to go with? Well, because it works. And by the way, I hear all the nattering on CNN and other networks, because the thing about Canadians is we're like, people living in the attic of your house. You really don't know anything about us, but we know everything about you. But we're also incredibly arrogant about it too. So I'm going to try and do this without being arrogant. The Republicans actually did better than predicted. They actually did. The Democrats were supposed to do better in the House than simply, I think it was 25 they ended up winning in the end. Most of the predictions were around 35 to 40, didn't happen. A lot of key governors didn't flip. And, the Senate, the Republicans held on to it. Now, unfortunately for the Democrats, and here's where I'm going to get a little political, the people who were voting against Donald Trump, which was the number one motivator for people voting for the Democrats, weren't necessarily voting for Nancy Pelosi either. So it's going to be an ugly contest over the space of the next 2 years as a very unpopular House leadership headed by Nancy Pelosi, and who also very much animates the nativists on the other side of it, the populists on the other side, and the animating factor for everybody who's on the other side of the debate, Donald Trump, going at it for 2 years. Maybe I won't come here as much as I usually do, but it's going to be very interesting to watch, and anybody trying to predict it right now it's a mug's game. But this idea that there was a great triumph on Tuesday night for the Democrats, they won the House. That's a big deal, but the king is not dead. He's merely wounded. Any last questions? Then I'll leave the stage. Oh, sure, go ahead. Yes, the evolution of the middle class. Everybody, the magical middle class. They are the most oppressed people in any society these days, they will tell you. And the reason is because the middle class is everybody. They can focus on 1%, or they can somehow define 1%, the wolves of Wall Street or whatever. But basically, if you go out and you ask Americans, are you a member of the middle class? You get over 80% of Americans saying that they are. And you get that in most countries, by the way. That people generally don't say they're members of the working class, and they don't say that they're members of the 1%. So the self-definition is an interesting, tricky problem. But the people who are sort of those true members of the middle class, suburban commuters, because that's who the middle class really is, suburban commuters, they're a tough audience these days, because everything seems to be moving against them, including things like, for example, climate change. These people drive to work, remember, and they're not driving electric cars. So every time you go out and you talk about a carbon tax and you're calling them polluters, you're wagging your finger at them. We need to engage everybody in a productive debate about climate change because it's important, it's real, it's a fact. But the way that we've been doing it through mostly virtue signaling and pointing our fingers in this way is not going to work. We have to bring these folks on side. And sticking them with a carbon tax, even though Nobel Prize winners say that it's the best way to do it, the truth is they're the ones who feel that they pay disproportionately for it, whether they do or they don't. So ladder up a whole series of different policies, because they're the taxpayers, they're the people who are in the middle of everything. They seem to be under a certain amount of pressure these days, or at least feel that they are. So connecting with that group is going to be the most important political decision that any political movement or party is going to have to make over the next while, and they may not be the middle class that we think they are. They are a pretty angry bunch these days, and you're going to have to find a way to get through to them.